talk about another important, a short time before I was talking about the hepatopulmonary syndrome versus the portopulmonary hypertension or the portopulmonary syndrome and the clinical pathological differences between both as being considered complications of patients suffering from advanced liver disease and portal hypertension. Now I will talk about an important issue in clinical practice, which is for clinicians to observe is the differences between, we should never forget the basic sciences while we are practicing as healthcare providers or healthcare professionals in clinical practice. As clinicians, we should never forget biochemistry, anatomy, and pathology, and of course physiology. Because as I mentioned before, disease is disturbance of anatomy and physiology of an organ or tissue. The disease is simply disturbance of the anatomy and the physiology and the biochemistry of a tissue or organ by a pathological process. Whether this etiopathological process is what called etiopathogenesis, whether this etiopathological process is inflammatory, infective, vascular, neoplastic, autoimmune, or other forms of pathology. But I mentioned the most common forms of pathological processes: the inflammatory, the infective, the autoimmune, the neoplastic, the vascular. This is the pathology, but this pathology will disturb the anatomy of that tissue, the physiology of that tissue, and the biochemistry of that tissue or organ. And so there will be clinical disease with clinical manifestations, symptoms, and signs. This is very basic and very essential to remember. Now let me shift to another important issue in the physiology of the human body, which is the hormones. We should never confuse between what we call hormones and pheromones. Pheromones. Both are different chemical substances. The hormones on one hand and the pheromones on the other hand. And also there is a difference between the hormones and the cytokines, for example. We should not confuse hormones for cytokines. We should not confuse hormones for neurotransmitters in the brain. There's difference between the hormones which act on the brain and the neurotransmitters, which are intrinsic chemical substances in the neuronal tissue of the brain. So there's a difference between hormones and the neurotransmitters, a difference between hormones and cytokines, which are chemical substances acting at the cellular level or in the intercellular interaction, and they are important in the molecular biology of disease. The cytokines, different from hormones. So hormones, different from cytokines, different from neurotransmitters, different from enzymes, different from pheromones. Let me now focus on the difference between the hormones and the pheromones. The hormone simply is a substance or a chemical substance or a chemical agent which is secreted by an endocrine gland inside the blood of the same individual and affects the metabolism and the physiology of the same individual. So they are secreted internally by an endocrine organ or an endocrine gland or an endocrine tissue. It's secreted inside the blood and reaches through the blood to its target organs where it exerts its final metabolic effects, and it affects the physiology and metabolism of the different tissues or targeted tissues in the body, whether a single tissue or the different tissues of the body. And we have, of course, the most common examples of hormones are the catecholamines, which are secreted by the adrenal medulla, the corticosteroids, which are also secreted by the adrenal cortex, the zona fasciculata, and some from the zona reticular, zona reticularis. Also this corticosteroids, also the aldosterone, which is secreted by the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex, and the insulin which is an important hormone for glucose metabolism created by the endocrine part of the pancreas, the islets of Langerhans, and the growth hormone, which is secreted secreted by the pituitary gland, generally the pituitary hormones secreted by the pituitary, which is the master gland of the human body, because it masters the lower down endocrine glands, the thyroid, the sex organs or the sexual glands, and the ovaries and testes, ovaries in females and testicles in males, for secretion of sex hormones. And of course, it masters the adrenal gland through the pituitary adrenal axis. And of course, we have other hormones secreted by other organs which are not controlled by the pituitary, namely the parathyroid gland secreting the parathyroid hormone or the parathormone, and the pancreas, which is also not controlled by the pituitary gland, and it secretes many important hormones, namely the insulin, glucagon, the vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, and somatostatin, and the other less important hormones. This is the endocrine pancreas. But insulin and glucagon are the most important to be secreted by the endocrine part of the pancreas, because we all know that the pancreas has both exocrine part and endocrine part. Anyway, so the hormone is secreted by an endocrine tissue or endocrine, and it acts on the tissues of the same individual. On the other hand, the pheromones, they are secreted externally. That is, on the external surface of the body, most commonly in the sweat, maybe in the vaginal secretions, maybe in the lacrimal secretion, that is the tears, maybe in the sweat, maybe in the secretion of the sebaceous glands. These are secreted externally, and they affect the interaction between the different individuals of the same species. For example, in sexual arousal, in the alarm reactions, in the interaction between the different individuals of the same species for to escape a danger, to mate together for mating, that is marriage, and the sexual function between the males and females of the same species. This is called the pheromones. So the pheromones, they trigger other signals between the individuals, different individuals of the same species. While the hormone acts on the same individual, it's not related to interaction with another individual or to signal some chemical signals in another individual. No, it's not related. So the pheromones act between different individuals of the same species. The hormone act inside the same individual, not related to the individual to individual interaction, as I mentioned. And the pheromones, they are secreted externally, while the hormones are secreted, as I mentioned, internally inside the bloodstream to affect at the end the physiology and metabolism of the human body at one or more tissues inside the body, according to the target of every individual hormone or hormones, as we all know from the physiological and biological point or biochemical point of view, for every hormone separately or concomitantly, that is, hormones acting together to affect the body metabolism. While the pheromones, they affect the, they might affect the, what we call the behavior of the individuals through chemical signals between individuals of the same species. So finally, affecting the physiology by, for example, the fear reaction or the fight-flight reaction or some other physiological response, plus it affects the behavior of the individual regarding the escape from dangerous situation, regarding mating together in sexual processes between individuals of the same species. So this is the pheromones. This is the difference between hormones and pheromones in medical, from the medical point of view. Also, we have to differentiate between endocrine gland, which is, as I mentioned, it is a gland which secretes some metabolite or a chemical substance. We call it a hormone inside the the blood, it's not related to the outside surface of the body. It's not connected to the outside. It's connected with the circulation of the same individual. So it pours بتصب السبستنس بتاعها inside the blood to reach a distant organ or organs or tissue to exert its hormonal effects according to every one individually, or every hormone individually. As I mentioned, examples of them: the growth hormone, the steroids, the catecholamines, the insulin, the parathyroid hormone, sex hormones, etc. These different hormones inside the body. This is the endocrine gland. It secretes a substance which we call it hormone into the bloodstream, and through the bloodstream it reaches to distant organ or tissue to exert its metabolic function, to affect homeostasis of the human body. This is the endocrine gland. But we have exocrine gland, which secretes its substance to the outside of the body. As we all know, the sebaceous glands, the lacrimal glands, the sweat glands, they are all exocrine glands, because they secrete its substances to the outside surface of the body, whether to a mucous membrane, for example, in the vagina, or in the oral mucosa, the salivary glands. It's an exocrine gland. Sweat glands is an exocrine, or to be more precise, it is a eccrine gland. We call it eccrine gland, because eccrine glands are primary sweat glands, which are specially condensed in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet and the forehead, but they are also present on the torso and the extremities, but less dense. The eccrine primary sweat glands. This is called eccrine glands. And they are important in the process of cooling of the surface of the body, cooling of the skin, and the thermoregulation as a physiologic process to regulate the body temperature of, or the human body, or the temperature of the human being. Thermoregulation. Eccrine primary sweat glands. This is called eccrine glands. ECCRINE. Eccrine primary sweat glands, which plays a role in thermoregulation. It's not related to hormones. It's not related to other things. So this is the eccrine glands. And exocrine, it secretes to the surface, like the secretion of the tears by the lacrimal glands, saliva by salivary glands, sweat by sweat glands, sebaceous or sebum by sebaceous glands. These are the other glands which are important in vaginal secretions and in the sexual process, which are related to the mucous membrane of the secondary genital organs in males and in females. These are all exocrine glands. And so there's a difference between endocrine and exocrine and eccrine. And also there's a difference between what we call the endocrine. I mentioned it is a tissue, it is a function which is served by secretion of hormone into the bloodstream, so it affects other distant organs by this chemical substance or chemical agent, which we call it a hormone. It is some sort of metabolic substance, which we call it a hormone. It is secreted by endocrine, or when the endocrine function is considered. And this is different from the what we call paracrine. Paracrine means the effect of cell on neighboring cells through some chemical substances. So it is related to cell-to-cell interaction in the same tissue, or tissue-to-tissue interaction in the same organ, or in the same anatomical environment. This is called the paracrine. So here the chemical substance acts to regulate the relationship or the function between cells inside the same tissue or tissues inside the same organ through this paracrine function. This is the paracrine. We call it paracrine regulation. Like the paracrine processes which affect the relationship between the different cells in the anterior pituitary gland, or the adenohypophysis, and between the adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis. This is in the pituitary gland, being the master gland of the other endocrine organs in the human body, through the axes, namely the pituitary thyroid, the pituitary adrenal, and the pituitary gonadal axes, the three important axes between the pituitary and the Inside the pituitary, there is many regulatory processes. Among them, the paracrine regulation affecting the relation between the different cells of the anterior pituitary, and between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. This is called paracrine function. Different from the endocrine function of the pituitary through its hormones secreted by the cell or the cell types of the anterior pituitary, namely the gonadotropes or the somatotropes secreting the growth hormone, or gonadotropes secreting the FSH and LH, or the thyrotropes secreting the TSH. These are the, and the, of course, the corticosteroid or the corticotropin secreting hormone, or the CRH. So this is the paracrine, which we should not confuse with the endocrine. And then autocrine, it is the effect of the cell on itself through substances within the cell. So we call this, which is the interaction of the constituents of the cell or the tissue with each other, at the same level together. We call it the autocrine. So the autocrine, the same cell or tissue by itself on itself. The paracrine, the different cells in the same tissue or the different tissues in the similar together. We call it the paracrine. And the endocrine is through a hormone which must be released into the bloodstream to reach its target tissue or organ to exert its metabolic and physiologic effects, and at the end affecting the metabolism and the homeostasis of the human body. So we should not confuse, we should observe the differences. This is very important in explaining the pathophysiology and pathobiology of disease, especially endocrine disease, or disease related to the endocrine and metabolic organs, or organs which play important in regulation of metabolism of the human body at its different levels, as I mentioned before. We have to observe the difference between endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine, the difference between the endocrine glands and the exocrine and ecrine, differences between the hormones and pheromones. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Tarek Ali.